The millionaire disguised himself and ordered coffee at his own bar, and the waitress left him speechless. With a quiet whisper, she revealed something never mentioned in the company's reports, but shouted in every glance around the room. The place he thought he knew hid abuse, sabotage, and a silent network of resistance. Unknowingly, he had stepped into the center of a dirty game, and the decision he was about to make would change everything, or destroy his reputation. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. And now, on with the story. Sunlight filtered timidly through the dusty windows of the Summit Cafe, a traditional establishment nestled in the heart of Shoreditch, a historic neighborhood in London. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the scent of old wood, and the stories accumulated over decades. It was the kind of place that had witnessed literary revolutions, passionate romances, and million-pound deals, all sealed between cups of coffee and homemade biscuits. Robert Vance, at 42, watched the street's activity from inside his imported car. A respected entrepreneur in the financial market, he was known for turning failing businesses into lucrative empires. His analytical coldness and decision-making abilities were legendary in London's business circles. With a net worth estimated in the billions, he rarely dedicated himself to businesses as small as a neighborhood cafe. But something about the Summit had captured his attention. "Are you sure you want to do this personally?" asked Frances, his assistant, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the purchase documents. "We could send a team to evaluate it." "This place has something different," Robert replied, without taking his eyes off the cafe's Art Deco facade. "The numbers don't make sense. An establishment with this tradition and location shouldn't be on the verge of bankruptcy. I want to understand what's happening on the inside." Robert adjusted the watch on his wrist, checked his disguise in the rearview mirror, thick-rimmed glasses, a few days' stubble, simple clothes, and got out of the car. The false identity was already prepared. Richard Graham, a writer searching for inspiration, would frequent the cafe daily to observe and understand what was wrong there. As he walked through the door, he felt the weight of history. The Summit Cafe had existed since 1932, founded by Italian and Japanese immigrants who blended their culinary traditions, creating a unique place that had survived all the transformations of the metropolis. The walls displayed black and white photographs, showing the cafe in different eras, during a historic social movement, in the celebrations for the '70 World Cup victory, and amid the democratic movements of the '80s. Robert chose a table in the corner, from where he could observe the entire environment. He soon noticed what the cold numbers in his reports didn't show. The place breathed tension. The waiters moved mechanically, avoiding eye contact with each other. Their smiles to customers were forced, rehearsed. At the counter, a middle-aged man with an authoritarian posture watched every move with a critical eye. "Good morning, would you like a menu?" A waitress approached, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Please, and which coffee would you recommend?" Robert asked, trying to make eye contact. "The traditional is—" she began but was interrupted. "Melissa." "Table 5 has been waiting for their bill for 5 minutes, shouted the man from the counter. "Sorry, I'll be right back," she murmured, hurrying away. For the next 2 hours, Robert observed. He noted in his notebook every interaction, every facial expression, every harsh command. The man at the counter, whom he later discovered was Oliver Miles, the manager, seemed to rule the place with an iron fist. He publicly criticized employees, established arbitrary rules, and changed procedures without explanation. The clientele was sparse for a Saturday morning. The few patrons seemed to be old customers who maintained the habit out of nostalgia. At a nearby table, 2 elderly gentlemen commented on the changes. "It's not the same since old Mr. Hayashi stepped away," one of them sighed. "Now it's just pressure shouting. Hey, even the coffee seems more bitter." The next day, Robert returned. And the next, and the next. He adopted a routine. He arrived early, ordered a coffee and some buttered toast, and sat writing in his notebook, sometimes notes about the cafe, sometimes reflections on what he observed. He began to notice patterns. Employees who arrived hopeful on their first day and within weeks transformed into downcast shadows. Loyal customers who gradually disappeared. Suppliers who delivered increasingly mediocre products. In the second week, something new captured his attention. A female employee of about 28, with curly hair tied in a discreet bun and deeply expressive dark brown eyes, moved through the room with a serenity that contrasted with the atmosphere. While everyone else seemed to be trying to disappear, she maintained a dignified posture, almost defiant in her calmness. Her name tag identified her, Beatrice Evans. Unlike the other employees, Beatrice looked customers in the eye. She smiled genuinely, even if with a trace of melancholy. When the manager shouted orders, she didn't shrink. She just nodded and continued her work with the same precision as before. "You come every day," she commented one morning, while serving Robert's coffee. It wasn't a question, just an observation. "I'm writing a book," he replied, maintaining his false identity. "I found inspiration here." "Interesting that someone would find inspiration in a place that's losing its own," she remarked, with a look that suggested she understood much more than she was saying. Before he could continue the conversation, the sound of broken crockery interrupted the moment. A new young waitress had dropped a tray of cups. The manager, Oliver, advanced furiously. "That's the second time this week. Do you know how much each of these pieces costs?" His voice echoed through the room, making the few customers present shrink in their seats. "The cost will come out of your salary." The waitress, almost a teenager, trembled as she picked up the shards. Robert watched the scene with growing discomfort. He was used to competitive corporate environments, but there was a difference between pressure for results and public humiliation. To his surprise, Beatrice calmly approached. "I'll help you." "Marina," she said, crouching beside the waitress. Then in a low but perfectly audible voice, she added, "And don't worry about the deduction. That's not legal." The look Oliver shot Beatrice contained pure hatred, but he didn't retort. Robert realized there was a story there, a dynamic his financial reports would never capture. By the end of the third week, Robert had compiled enough information to understand why the Summit Cafe was sinking. The toxic management had created an unsustainable environment, driving away both customers and talented employees. Staff turnover was extremely high, generating training costs and constant errors. The service, once a distinguishing feature, had become mechanical and distant. It was time to move on to the next phase. The following morning, dressed in his impeccable suit, Robert Vance, now without his disguise, entered the cafe accompanied by his legal team. He introduced himself as the new owner of the establishment and called an emergency meeting with the administrative team. The shock on Oliver's face was priceless. Even more surprising was the brief flash of hope Robert caught in Beatrice's eyes before she reassumed her neutral expression. That small moment of vulnerability revealed something he hadn't expected to find in his investigation, a thread of expectation, a persistent belief that something could change. And it was at that exact moment that Robert realized his mission at the Summit Cafe would be far more complex than simply restructuring a business. There was something deeper at play, something that he, with all his experience in numbers and strategies, still needed to fully comprehend. The meeting in the small back room of the Summit Cafe was thick with tension. Robert Vance, now revealed as the new owner, presented charts and spreadsheets illustrating the establishment's critical situation. Oliver Miles, the manager, kept his arms crossed and a cynical smile on his face. Over the last 2 years, revenue has dropped by 62%. Online complaints have increased by 340%. The employee turnover rate is one of the highest I've ever seen in any business, Robert explained, swiping through slides on his tablet. "And you know what's most interesting? This cafe has a prime location and a history of almost a century." "With all due respect, Mr. Vance," Oliver interrupted, "but managing a cafe isn't like running your tech companies. The competition is unfair. We have international chains on the same street offering prices we can't possibly match." Adrian Campbell, the weary-looking accountant, added, "Besides, today's employees aren't like they used to be. They can't handle pressure. They want praise for doing the bare minimum." Robert listened attentively to the justifications. It was always the same. When the numbers pointed to failures, the blame was shifted to external factors: competition, the market, employees. Never to management. "Curious," he replied calmly, "because I spent 3 weeks here as a customer. I observed everything. And you know what caught my attention the most? The wasted potential." Silence filled the room. Robert continued, "I saw employees being publicly humiliated. I saw customers waiting for service while you argued in the back. I saw talented people being treated as disposable. His voice, though soft, carried an unshakable firmness, and that ends today. He then announced his first decision, a complete audit of the management, starting with individual interviews with all employees. Oliver immediately protested, claiming it would destabilize the operation, but Robert was adamant. The interviews begin tomorrow, and they will be conducted without the presence of current management, he finished, ending the meeting. As he left the room, Robert found the main area almost empty. In the farthest corner, Beatrice was meticulously cleaning a table while humming softly. She seemed oblivious to the administrative revolution that had just taken place. But her eyes, when they looked up and met his, revealed a deep understanding. "So the writer was the owner," she commented as he approached. There was no accusation in her voice, only a statement of fact. "How did you figure it out?" Robert asked, genuinely surprised. "Nobody pays that much attention just to write a book," she answered, folding the cleaning cloth with precision. "And your shoes were too expensive for an ordinary writer." Robert couldn't suppress a smile. In 3 weeks undercover, no one had questioned his story. No one except Beatrice. "Things are going to change around here," he stated. "I've heard that before," she replied, with a sad smile that carried the weight of many broken promises. The next day, the interviews revealed what Robert already suspected. The Summit Cafe was ruled by fear. Employees reported verbal abuse, unpaid overtime, and veiled threats. Most spoke in whispers, constantly glancing at the door, fearing reprisals. Beatrice's interview, however, was different. She entered the room with an erect posture, sat down calmly, and spoke with impressive clarity. "The problem didn't start with Oliver," she explained. "It began about 3 years ago, when Mr. Hayashi, the former owner, fell ill. His nephew, Paul Hayashi, informally took over management and brought in Oliver, his friend from university. Since then, the cafe has become a battlefield." Robert listened intently, making occasional notes. Beatrice continued. "They fired Mrs. Clara Gable, the previous manager, who had worked here for 27 years. She tried to protect the team from the new policies. Then they started replacing the traditional suppliers with cheaper ones. The quality dropped, the customers noticed. "Why did you stay?" Robert asked, truly curious. "Someone with your perception could work anywhere." Beatrice's face hardened subtly. She adjusted her posture before answering. "We don't always have the luxury of choice, Mr. Vance." The enigmatic answer hung in the air. Before he could explore it further, they were interrupted by the sound of an argument coming from the main room. Robert excused himself and went to check. In the middle of the cafe, Oliver was confronting Marina, the young waitress who had broken the cups days before. He was accusing her of speaking ill of him in the interview, threatening her subtly. The girl was trembling, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Miles." Robert's voice cut through the scene like a razor. "In my office now." The conversation was brief and definitive. Oliver was fired on the spot, escorted out by security. As he left, he shot a venomous look at Beatrice, who watched the scene with a neutral expression. That afternoon, Robert gathered all the employees. He announced immediate changes. Oliver and his entire administrative team had been dismissed. A new structure would be implemented. No retaliation would be tolerated against anyone who had spoken in the interviews. "This cafe has almost a century of history," Robert said, looking at each face in the room. "It was built by immigrants who believed in dignified work and quality products. We are going to return to those roots." After the meeting, as the employees processed the news with a mixture of relief and suspicion, Robert approached Beatrice again. She was organizing the pastry counter, meticulously arranging each item. "I need someone who truly knows this place," he began. "Someone who understands its essence, not just its problems." Beatrice paused her work, looking at him directly. "Are you offering me the manager's position?" she asked with a hint of distrust. "No, I'm offering something different. I want you to be a consultant in the reformulation. You know this place, its history, its strengths, and you clearly have ideas on how to improve it." She hesitated, pondering the proposal. "Why me? There are employees who have been here longer. Because for 3 weeks you were the only one who maintained dignity without losing kindness. The only one who defended other employees without seeking confrontation. And most importantly," Robert paused significantly, "the only one who saw through my disguise. An almost imperceptible smile touched Beatrice's lips. "Can I think about it?" "Of course. But while you're thinking, I'd like you to show me something." "What?" "What really happened to the experimental kitchen in the back?" "The one that's been locked for years." Beatrice's eyes widened slightly, revealing genuine surprise. "How do you know about that?" "I read the original architectural plans in the city archives. The Summit Cafe was designed with a space for culinary experimentation. In the old photos, local and international chefs are seen working there. Now it's a locked storage room. I want to know why." Beatrice's expression transformed. For the first time, Robert saw something beyond her contained serenity. He saw passion. "Come with me," she said simply. They crossed the room to a discreet door at the back. Beatrice took a small bunch of keys from her pocket. "No one knows I have this," she explained, selecting an old key. "Mrs. Clara Gable gave it to me before she left. She said that one day someone might reopen this space." The door opened with a protesting creak. The room was dark and dusty. Beatrice switched on the lights, revealing a surprisingly large space. Old but high-quality equipment occupied the counters. On the walls, chalkboards still displayed handwritten recipes, preserved by time. There was something almost sacred about the forgotten place. "This was the heart of the Summit Cafe," Beatrice explained, her voice filled with reverence. "This is where the pastries that made this place famous were born. This is where renowned chefs came to experiment with fusions of Italian, Japanese, and British cuisine." Robert observed not just the physical space, but mainly the transformation in Beatrice. Her eyes shone, her hands gestured with excitement as she explained every detail. It was as if another person was emerging from within the reserved employee he had known. "Why did they close it?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Creativity doesn't fit on cost spreadsheets, Mr. Vance," she replied, running her fingers over an old recipe book. "Paul Hayashi said it was a waste of space and resources." At that moment, contemplating Beatrice among the dust-covered equipment, Robert had an epiphany. The true value of the Summit Cafe was not in its historic walls or its prime location. It was in people like Beatrice, people who, despite everything, still held the flame of passion. "We're going to reopen this space," he declared. It wasn't a suggestion or a request. It was a certainty. Beatrice looked at him for a long moment as if trying to gauge his sincerity. "You don't know me," she finally said. "How you don't know if I'm qualified for this?" Robert's smile was calm and confident. "Then tell me who you are." "Beatrice Evans. Because I have a feeling there's much more behind that serene facade." What he didn't expect was that the story behind this enigmatic woman would completely change his perspective not only on the cafe, but on his own role as an entrepreneur. The experimental kitchen, despite the accumulated dust, transformed into an unexpected sanctuary. Seated on old stools, with cups of coffee prepared on the small, newly cleaned gas stove, Robert and Beatrice talked as if the rest of the world didn't exist. Through the narrow window, the light of the London sunset tinted the room in orange hues. "I was born in Penzance, on the coast of Cornwall," Beatrice began, after a long, contemplative silence. "A small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone. My mother had a simple restaurant, mostly frequented by fishermen and occasional tourists." Her fingers traced circles on the marble tabletop as she spoke. Robert watched her every move, every nuance of expression. "From a young age, the kitchen was my playground. By 12, I was already creating desserts that customers specifically requested. My specialty was sweets that combined coastal ingredients with techniques I learned from old books in the local library." A nostalgic smile briefly lit up her face. "When I finished school, I won a scholarship to study gastronomy in London. It was as if a whole new universe opened up for me. I studied like crazy, did unpaid internships at renowned restaurants, slept 4 hours a night." She paused, taking a sip of coffee. "So I graduated with honors. I was selected for a specialization program in contemporary pastry, with an internship in Portugal." Robert noticed how her posture changed when she spoke of that period, more erect, more confident. "What happened next?" he asked, genuinely interested. Beatrice's expression subtly hardened. "I got a job at Scent and Soul, a restaurant that was considered London's new gastronomic sensation. The executive chef, Henry Martin, was celebrated as a genius. Magazines, TV shows, international awards." Her voice took on a metallic quality. "No one talked about how he treated the staff when the cameras weren't rolling. Robert remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. At first I thought it was normal. The pressure of high-end gastronomy, the perfectionism. We worked 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. I endured insults, public humiliation, thrown objects. Beatrice took a deep breath. But then it started to get worse. Henry began to harass the women on the team. Comments, accidental touches, invitations to private meetings. Her eyes met Robert's with a defiant intensity. One day, our youngest kitchen assistant, Julianne, who was only 19, came to me crying. Henry had been explicit about what she would need to do to get ahead in her career. That same night I gathered evidence, messages, accounts from other victims, and filed a formal complaint with the restaurant's management. And did they take action? Robert asked, already suspecting the answer. Beatrice let out a bitter laugh. Action? Yes, they did. 2 weeks later, I was fired for incompatibility with the house's creative philosophy. So was Julianne. And all the others who had confirmed my story. Henry is still there with another Michelin star and a TV show. The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. I tried to get a job at other restaurants, but the gastronomy industry in London is a small circle. Someone had always heard about me. The troublemaker. The difficult one. The jealous one who wanted to take down a talented chef. Robert watched as her hands, once so steady when handling utensils and ingredients, now trembled slightly. I sold almost everything I had to survive. Just as I was about to move back to Penzance, I found the ad for the Summit Cafe. Mrs. Clara Gable hired me on the spot. She saw something in me that I could no longer see in myself. And now you're here serving coffee and cleaning tables, Robert concluded, finally understanding. Yes, and you know what's ironic? I don't regret a thing. I'd do it all again. Her eyes shone with a steely determination. Some nights when I close my eyes, I still see Julianne's face. She gave up her dream of being a chef. Last I heard, she was working as a supermarket cashier. Robert felt something unusual, a lump in his throat, an emotion he rarely experienced in the calculated corporate world he inhabited. The stories he usually heard involved mergers, acquisitions, market strategies, never real people, with shattered dreams and silent courage. You could have mentioned your qualifications when you applied for the job here, he commented. With your resume, you'd be more than a waitress. And risk more questions about why I left Scent and Soul? No, thank you. I've learned that sometimes it's better to start from scratch. Beatrice stood up, closing the subject. It's getting late. We should head back. As they were closing up the experimental kitchen, Robert asked the question that had been nagging him. Why are you telling me all this now? Beatrice faced him with an enigmatic expression. Because you asked for honesty, and because you need to understand that there are some things your money can't just fix. In the following days, the transformation of the Summit Cafe began at a rapid pace. Robert brought in a transition team to reorganize the operation, while Beatrice, after some hesitation, accepted the role of consultant. Together, they spent hours discussing every aspect of the business, from the menu to the physical environment and internal relations. The cafe needs to return to its roots, Beatrice explained, spreading old photographs across the meeting room table. It was a meeting place, a place of cultural exchange. The Japanese immigrants brought precise preparation techniques. The Italians contributed their passion for ingredients, and all of it blended with British hospitality. Robert, accustomed to leading meetings with high-level executives, was surprised by the enthusiasm he felt in these sessions. There was something refreshing in the way Beatrice approached challenges, with creativity and unwavering principles. The reopening of the experimental kitchen became the central project. They cleaned the space, restored old equipment, and brought in some modern pieces. Beatrice began dedicating her mornings to testing recipes, merging contemporary techniques with traditional formulas found in the cafe's dusty notebooks. One afternoon, as Robert was analyzing spreadsheets at his makeshift desk, he smelled an irresistible aroma. Beatrice appeared at the door carrying a small plate. "Try this," she said, placing what looked like a delicate cake in front of him. It's a reinterpretation of the dessert that made the Summit famous in the 50s, a Brazil nut cake with a coffee infusion and a touch of miso. Upon tasting it, Robert closed his eyes involuntarily. It was an extraordinary sensory experience. The balanced sweetness, the complexity of flavors, the perfect texture. "This is," he began, searching for words. "I know," she interrupted, with the first genuinely happy smile he had witnessed. "It's what it should have always been." That moment marked a turning point. Beatrice's passion for gastronomy, previously hidden under layers of caution, emerged with full force. She began training other employees, sharing technical knowledge and sparking enthusiasm. The cafe's atmosphere, once oppressive, gradually transformed into something vibrant. Robert, for his part, found himself in uncharted territory. Accustomed to maintaining an emotional distance from his investments, he was surprised to find himself increasingly involved, not just with the business, but with the people, especially with Beatrice, whose courage and talent fascinated him in an unexpected way. One morning, while reorganizing the storeroom, they found a box of old documents from the cafe. Among them, a framed certificate, Gastronomy and Culture Award, Best Culinary Fusion, 1987. "Mrs. Clara Gable used to talk about this," Beatrice commented, carefully wiping the dusty glass. "This was when the summit was at its peak." "We can get there again," Robert replied, with a certainty that went beyond the numbers on his spreadsheets. Their gazes met, holding for a moment longer than necessary. There was a growing connection between them, something built on mutual respect and a shared purpose. The transformation process was not without its challenges. Some employees, accustomed to the old system, resisted the changes. Suppliers needed to be won back. And there was the challenge of reattracting the customers who had abandoned the cafe after years of decline. It was during a particularly tense meeting about the renovation budget that the first sign of external trouble appeared. Julianne, the receptionist, nervously entered the room. "Mr. Vance, there's a man insisting on speaking with the owner. He says it's urgent." Robert and Beatrice exchanged worried glances before heading to the main room. There, a man of about 50, wearing an impeccable suit, waited with an arrogant expression. Upon seeing Robert, he flashed a calculated smile. "Mr. Vance, we finally meet the mysterious buyer. Paul Hayashi," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "I believe we have a lot to talk about." Robert shook the offered hand with studied firmness. "How can I help you, Mr. Hayashi? I've come to clear up a small misunderstanding. You see, when my uncle decided to sell the summit, certain contractual details may have been omitted." His gaze slid to Beatrice, narrowing slightly. "I see you've already met our problematic employee." The tension was palpable. Beatrice remained impassive, though Robert could see the slight tensing of her shoulders. "What details would those be?" Robert asked, keeping his tone neutral. "Nothing we can't resolve in a private conversation," Paul replied. "Let's just say the Summit Cafe isn't as simple as it seems. There are undocumented shares, family legacies. You understand?" The insinuation was clear. There was more at stake than what was in the official purchase documents. "My lawyers thoroughly reviewed every aspect of the transaction," Robert countered, "but I'm open to discussing any legitimate concerns you may have." "Excellent." Paul's smile widened, revealing perfectly aligned teeth. "How about tomorrow at my office? I'm sure we'll reach a mutually beneficial agreement." As he handed over his card, Paul cast one last look at Beatrice. "An interesting choice of consultant, Mr. Vance. I hope you're aware of Miss Evans's troubled history." After Paul left, a heavy silence filled the room. Beatrice was the first to break it. "He's not going to make things easy," she said simply. "What exactly does he mean by undocumented shares?" Robert asked. "What he's always wanted, control." Paul Hayashi never accepted that his uncle left the cafe to other heirs. He managed it from the shadows through Oliver, while Mr. Hayashi was ill. Beatrice crossed her arms. "And now he's afraid of losing that influence." Robert contemplated the card in his hands, sensing this was just the beginning of a larger conflict. "Do you think he has any legal basis for his claims?" "I don't know, but I know Paul well enough to know he wouldn't show up without a plan." She hesitated before continuing. "Maybe you should reconsider your investment here. The summit might not be worth all this headache." Robert looked around the cafe's main room, where employees were working with renewed energy. He saw the first signs of transformation, new colors on the walls, the promising aroma coming from the experimental kitchen, the light in the eyes of people who were beginning to believe in real change. "Do you know why I bought this place, Beatrice?" he asked, turning to her. At first, it was just curiosity, a financial puzzle that didn't make sense. But now, he paused significantly, now it's about something much bigger. Their gazes met again, communicating far more than words ever could. At that moment, they both knew that the challenge thrown down by Paul Hayashi was just the first of many obstacles they would face. And, without needing to say it, a mutual decision was made. The Summit Cafe was worth the fight to come. Paul Hayashi's office was an exact reflection of the man himself, ostentatious, calculatedly impressive and cold. Located on the 20th floor of a commercial building in Canary Wharf, it offered a panoramic view of the city that seemed to emphasize the position of superiority he so cherished. Robert arrived punctually for the meeting, accompanied by Marcella Rhodes, his trusted lawyer. Contrary to what Paul probably expected, he was not intimidated by the environment. After 2 decades navigating among the sharks of the financial market, he knew how to recognize intimidation tactics. "Mr. Vance, welcome." Paul greeted him with false cordiality. Behind him, 2 men in suits waited with impassive expressions. "I see you've brought reinforcements." "As have you," Robert replied calmly. "Shall we get straight to the point?" Seated at a tempered glass meeting table, Paul finally revealed his hand. "When my uncle fell ill, we made a verbal agreement. I would take over the strategic management of the summit, maintaining the family tradition." Paul slowly leafed through a folder of documents. "Unfortunately, his health deteriorated before we could formalize certain understandings." "Undocumented understandings have no legal value," Marcella interjected, adjusting her glasses. Paul smiled condescendingly. "Under normal circumstances, I would agree. But I have here," he slid a document across the table, "a power of attorney signed by my uncle granting me the authority to negotiate on his behalf, including the 30% stake that was not included in the official sale." Robert examined the document carefully. The power of attorney was dated 3 years prior, before Mr. Hayashi's health had worsened. The signature looked authentic, but something about the whole thing didn't sit right. "Interesting," he commented, "especially considering your uncle sold 100% of the establishment, as documented at the registry. A misunderstanding, surely." "My uncle was not in his right mind in his final months." "Even so, the sale was approved by the judge overseeing his assets during his illness," Marcella countered. Paul's smile faltered for a moment. "What I'm proposing, Mr. Vance, is a simple agreement. Acknowledge my 30% stake, keep me informed of strategic decisions, and we can avoid a long and draining lawsuit that will only harm the business." The veiled threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. "And if I refuse?" Paul leaned back in his chair, joining his fingertips in a studiedly casual gesture. "Then I will have to use every legal resource at my disposal, including questioning my uncle's mental capacity at the time of the sale. That would freeze the summit's operations for months, perhaps years, not to mention the negative publicity." He paused dramatically. "I would also be forced to make public the troubling history of certain employees. That young woman, Beatrice, for example. She has quite a problematic past in the culinary world." The mention of Beatrice's name provoked a wave of anger in Robert that he skillfully concealed behind a neutral expression. He was used to aggressive negotiations, but there was something particularly repulsive about the way Paul weaponized vulnerable people. "I need time to review this situation with my legal team," he finally replied. "We will be in touch in a few days." Paul nodded, satisfied. "Of course. And in the meantime, perhaps you'll reconsider some of your changes at the cafe, especially that experimental kitchen. A waste of space and resources, in my opinion." Leaving the building, Robert felt uneasy, not because of the threat itself — he had faced far more formidable adversaries — but because of the motivation behind it. Paul Hayashi didn't seem driven just by money, but by a perverse desire for control. "What do you think?" he asked Marcella as they got into the car. "The power of attorney is potentially problematic, but we can work around it. What worries me is his willingness to engage in a long battle." Marcella organized her notes methodically. "He has local connections, knows suppliers, former employees. He can create practical obstacles that no contract can foresee." Robert nodded, pensive. "We need to find out more about this relationship between Paul and his uncle. Something doesn't add up." Back at the Summit Cafe, they found Beatrice supervising a training session with the team. Her concentrated expression softened slightly upon seeing them, but she quickly noticed the tension on their faces. "That bad?" she asked when they moved to the meeting room. Robert recounted the conversation, including the veiled threat against her. Beatrice listened without showing surprise. Paul has always been like that. Using personal information as a weapon is his specialty. He can't harm you with that, Robert stated. You reported an abuser. That makes you a hero, not a villain. Beatrice let out a bitter laugh. In an ideal world, yes. In the real one, she shook her head. Anyway, this isn't about me. It's about the summit. If Paul gets a stake, he'll suffocate any real change. We'll be back to square one. That night, after the cafe had closed, Robert remained alone, analyzing spreadsheets and legal strategies. He was so engrossed that he didn't notice Beatrice's presence until she placed a cup of coffee in front of him. Thought you might need this, she said, sitting on the other side of the table. It's a special blend. Helps to clear the mind. The aroma was extraordinary. Complex, comforting, invigorating. Taking a sip, Robert felt the tension ease slightly. Thank you. It's excellent. A comfortable silence settled between them. For the first time in many years, Robert felt genuinely at ease in someone's presence. There was no need for masks, strategies, or personas. It was just him, with all the doubts and uncertainties he rarely allowed himself to show. You know what I'm thinking? Beatrice broke the silence, contemplating her own cup. That maybe Paul is right about one thing. What's that? That I'm an unnecessary complication in this process. Her eyes met his with serene determination. My presence gives him ammunition against you. Maybe it would be better if I stepped away, at least until you resolve this legal issue. Absolutely not. Robert's response was immediate and firm. We are not giving in to intimidation, and you are essential to everything we're building here. Beatrice studied him for a moment, as if searching for signs of hesitation in his face. Why? She finally asked. Why do you care so much about this place? About these people? She hesitated, about me. The question caught Robert off guard. It was something he had been asking himself. Why had this small cafe, among all the ventures he managed, become so personal? All my life I've built businesses based on numbers, he began, choosing his words carefully. Efficiency, profit margins, return on investment. It worked. I built an empire. He paused, looking around the empty cafe. But here, for the first time, I saw something my spreadsheets never captured. The human cost of purely commercial decisions. Their gazes met again, with an intensity that made the connection between them almost tangible. As for caring about you, he continued, his voice taking on a softer tone, that's new for me too. And a little scary, to be honest. Beatrice lowered her eyes, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. When she looked up at him again, there was vulnerability in her gaze. I'm afraid to trust again, she admitted, especially someone with so much power. Understandable, but I'm also tired of living on the defensive, of always expecting the worst from people. The moment was fragile, charged with possibilities. Robert knew that anything he said now could either strengthen or destroy the nascent trust between them. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes, he said finally, but I promise I will always listen, and that I will never ever use power as a weapon. Beatrice nodded slowly, accepting the promise for what it was, imperfect, honest, human. The moment was interrupted by the ringing of Robert's phone. It was Marcella. We found something interesting about Paul Hayashi, the lawyer announced without preamble. He's in serious financial trouble. His import company has suffered significant losses in recent quarters. It seems the stake in the summit would be a lifeline. The information changed the landscape. If Paul was acting out of financial desperation, there might be a simpler solution than they had anticipated. After hanging up, Robert shared the news with Beatrice. Together, they began to devise a strategy to deal with Paul, an approach that combined legal firmness with a deeper understanding of the human motivations involved. The next morning, as the sun was just beginning to rise, Beatrice arrived at the cafe to find Robert already at work. He looked as if he hadn't slept, but his eyes shone with renewed determination. Good morning, he smiled, holding up a folder. I have an idea to neutralize Paul, but I need your help with something more important. What is it? The grand reopening of the summit. In 2 weeks, Beatrice's eyes widened. 2 weeks? That's impossible. We're still in the middle of renovations. The staff training isn't complete. The new menu... That's exactly why we need to speed things up, he interrupted. The faster we establish the cafe's new identity, the harder it will be for Paul to reverse the changes, even if he wins some legal victory. The logic made sense, but the deadline seemed insane. "We're going to need help," she concluded. "I've already thought of that." Robert handed her a list. "These are former employees of the summit who left during Oliver's management. People who, according to reports, were talented and dedicated, including Mrs. Clara Gable, the old manager." Beatrice scanned the list with growing hope. She knew many of those names, people who had left carrying grievances and wasted potential. "Do you think they would agree to come back? For an honest project with dignified conditions? It's worth a try." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. While Marcella and the legal team worked behind the scenes to contain Paul, the Summit Cafe transformed into a construction site of both physical structures and ideas. Beatrice led the culinary revitalization, creating a menu that honored the establishment's multicultural roots while introducing contemporary touches. The experimental kitchen operated at full steam, with daily tests and tasting sessions that quickly became the highlight of the day for everyone involved. Robert, meanwhile, coordinated the physical renovation of the space and the establishment of new management policies. To the team's surprise, he instituted a system where all employees had a voice in operational decisions. Open weekly meetings became routine, and suggestions were actively encouraged. Mrs. Clara Gable, at 68, agreed to return as a senior consultant, bringing with her the wisdom of someone who had dedicated decades to the summit. Her presence was a living reminder of the tradition and values the cafe had represented in its best days. Amid the hustle and bustle, the relationship between Robert and Beatrice deepened. Working side by side, sharing challenges and small victories, they discovered layers of compatibility that transcended their very different origins. There was mutual respect, yes, but also a growing attraction that both silently acknowledged but hesitated to name. 3 days before the reopening, when everything seemed to be falling into place despite the tight schedule, Julianne ran to them in the middle of a training session, visibly upset. "There's a health inspector here. He says he received an anonymous complaint about inadequate hygiene conditions." Exchanging worried glances, Robert and Beatrice knew exactly who was behind it. The battle with Paul Hayashi had just escalated to a new level, and the reopening, now more than ever, felt like a race against time and against forces determined to prevent the Summit Cafe from rising from the ashes. The health inspection was just the beginning of a series of obstacles that seemed to arise in a calculated sequence. Suppliers cancelled last-minute deliveries, citing inexplicable logistical problems. The technician responsible for installing the new exhaust system simply failed to show up. A mysterious leak flooded part of the pantry, destroying newly acquired ingredients. In the eye of this storm, Beatrice and Robert worked tirelessly, adapting to each new challenge. The reopening date was approaching relentlessly, and postponing was not an option. "He's not going to give up," Beatrice commented as she reorganized the pantry after the leak. "Paul has a lot of influence in this neighborhood. He knows everyone. Many people owe him favors." Robert, helping to dry the floor, nodded gravely. Marcella found out more about his situation. He invested heavily in a real estate development that stalled due to licensing issues. He's practically broke. "And he probably sees the summit as an asset he could liquidate quickly," Beatrice concluded. A sudden thought occurred to Robert. Or maybe something more. The cafe's location is prime. The land alone is worth millions. Beatrice stopped what she was doing, understanding the implication. "You think that he wants the summit not to save it, but to sell it to property developers? It's a possibility we have to consider." The idea was disturbing. The Summit Cafe wasn't just a business. It was a historical and cultural asset to the neighborhood, a living testament to the influence of immigrants in shaping London's identity. "If that's the case, we have to act faster," Beatrice determined. "The reopening needs to be a resounding success, something that makes it impossible to justify destroying the cafe." As they worked, a curious crowd began to form outside. Old residents, drawn by rumors of the renovation, peeked through the partially covered windows. Young people from the neighborhood took photos of the restored sign and shared them on social media, generating buzz. Robert watched the activity with growing interest. "The community could be our greatest ally against Paul," he reflected. If we can reconnect the summit with the neighborhood, create a sense of belonging, an idea began to form, a strategy that went beyond spreadsheets and legal arguments. The next morning, Mrs. Clara Gable arrived with a surprise. 5 elderly ladies, all between 75 and 90 years old, carrying boxes of old photographs and yellowed notebooks. The guardians of memory, Mrs. Clara Gable introduced them with reverence. Patrons of the summit since they were young women. They know every story, every recipe, every change. The ladies, representing the diverse immigrant communities of the neighborhood, became honorary consultants for the project. Mrs. Chio, 89, brought Japanese pastry recipes that had influenced the cafe's first sweets. Mrs. Elena, an 82-year-old Italian, shared coffee preparation techniques her father had taught the founders. Mrs. Grace, 78, a Londoner of Caribbean descent, recalled how the summit had been one of the first fancy establishments to welcome working-class people without prejudice. Beatrice coordinated a task force to document these memories and incorporate them into the cafe's new identity. Old photographs were restored and framed to decorate the walls. Traditional recipes were adapted for contemporary palates. Stories were compiled onto small cards that would accompany each dish on the new menu. Meanwhile, Robert mobilized another front. Through press contacts, he arranged for journalists specializing in food and culture to visit the cafe during the preparations, generating anticipation. An independent documentary filmmaker began to record the revitalization process, interviewing old customers and employees. 2 days before the reopening, a surprise, Henry Martin, the famous chef who had harassed Beatrice and other employees, announced on social media that he would be making a technical visit to the summit to evaluate whether the traditional cafe had the potential to reinvent itself. The news fell like a bombshell on the team. "This has Paul's fingerprints all over it," Beatrice stated, her face pale. "He knows exactly what he's doing." Henry's presence would be destabilizing on its own, but the worst part was the implication. If the renowned chef publicly criticized the renovated cafe, it could compromise the entire effort to reconnect with the public. His opinion, unfortunately, still carried weight in London's gastronomic scene. "We can stop him from entering," Robert suggested. "It's a private event, after all." Beatrice considered the suggestion but shook her head. No, that would be exactly what he wants, to create controversy, to look like the censored victim. She took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. "Let him come. Let him taste what we've created. If he has an ounce of professional honesty, he'll have to acknowledge the quality." "And if he doesn't?" Robert asked, concerned about the impact the reunion would have on her. Beatrice's gaze hardened, revealing the inner strength that had allowed her to survive so many adversities. "Then I'll be ready to face him. No longer as a vulnerable employee, but as the co-creator of something I deeply believe in." The eve of the reopening was marked by a feverish energy. Everyone worked beyond their limits, polishing, organizing, finalizing. The experimental kitchen, now fully revitalized, produced the last tests of the dishes to be served the next day. As night fell, when most of the team had gone home to rest for the big day, Beatrice remained alone in the kitchen, perfecting the dessert that would be the flagship of the new menu, a reinterpretation of the famous cake that had made the summit's reputation in the 50s, now with a contemporary twist she had spent weeks developing. She was so focused that she didn't notice Robert's presence until he spoke. "Shouldn't you be resting for tomorrow?" She smiled without taking her eyes off the glaze she was applying with millimeter precision. "I could say the same to you." "Fair enough," he approached, watching the meticulous work of her hands. "It's perfect. Not yet, but it will be." She made one last adjustment and finally stepped back to admire her creation. This dessert represents everything the summit was and can be again. Tradition and innovation in balance. There was something so vulnerable and yet so powerful in her dedication that Robert felt a lump in his throat. Beatrice had invested not just her technique, but her soul in the cafe's revitalization. "I have something for you," he said, holding out a small package. Surprised, Beatrice accepted the gift and opened it carefully. Inside was a delicate metal flower, a piece of craftsmanship made from parts of the cafe's old ventilation system. transformed into something beautiful and lasting. It's, she hesitated, visibly moved. Scrap metal turned into art, Robert explained. I thought it symbolized what we're doing here. Their gazes met, and in that moment, the connection between them transcended words. Slowly, almost hesitantly, they moved closer to each other. The first kiss was gentle, a mutual acknowledgement that something significant had been born between them, something built on respect, admiration, and shared values. When they parted, Beatrice smiled with a mix of joy and vulnerability. "This complicates things, you know," she teased, though there was a serious question implied. "The best things in life usually do," he replied, "and I've never shied away from complexity." The day of the reopening dawned sunny, as if even the weather was conspiring in favor of the Summit Cafe. From early on, a surprising queue began to form on the pavement, old neighborhood residents, young people attracted by the social media buzz, journalists and the curious. Inside the cafe, the team was putting on the final touches. The transformation was visible in every detail. The main room had regained its original Art Deco charm, now complemented by subtle modern elements. The warmer lighting highlighted the historic photographs on the walls. The aroma of freshly ground coffee and baked bread enveloped the atmosphere like an embrace. At 10 a.m. sharp, Robert and Beatrice, side by side, opened the doors. The crowd entered amidst applause and exclamations of surprise. Many of the older patrons had tears in their eyes as they recognized elements that had disappeared during years of mismanagement. Mrs. Clara Gable and the Guardians of Memory occupied a special table, receiving tributes and sharing stories with anyone who approached. At another table, journalists photographed and scribbled notes frantically, clearly impressed with the renovation. Everything was running perfectly until, around noon, a murmur spread through the entrance. Henry Martin had arrived, accompanied by his producer and a small film crew, apparently preparing content for his TV show. The entire room seemed to freeze. Beatrice, who was serving a nearby table, slowly straightened her back. Robert, sensing the immediate tension, discreetly approached. "We can ask them to leave," he whispered. "This is harassment." "No," she replied with surprising firmness. "Let him taste what we've created. The food will speak for itself." Henry strode through the room with the arrogance of someone who knows they are being watched. He sat at a central table and, without consulting the menu, began ordering loudly, clearly trying to establish dominance. Beatrice took a deep breath and walked over to him with impeccable posture. "Welcome to the Summit Cafe, Chef Martin," she greeted with glacial professionalism. "I'm Beatrice Evans, the gastronomic consultant. If you'll permit me a suggestion, we've prepared a tasting menu that presents the essence of our proposal." The shock on Henry's face upon recognizing her was momentarily visible before he regained his composure. "Beatrice. What an interesting surprise." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I heard you had left professional gastronomy after some unfortunate incidents." "I never left gastronomy, only toxic environments," she replied calmly. "May I arrange the tasting menu for you?" Disconcerted by her direct response and unwavering posture, Henry nodded, casting a calculated glance around. Robert watched from a distance, ready to intervene if necessary, but trusting in the strength he saw in Beatrice. What followed was almost cinematic. Dish after dish, Beatrice personally presented each creation, explaining the historical roots, the techniques employed, the choice of ingredients. The execution was flawless. Even Henry, known for his relentless criticism, seemed genuinely impressed, though he tried to hide it. The final dessert, the cake Beatrice had perfected the night before, was served with a small printed story, recounting how that recipe had sustained the cafe during the difficult post-war years and how it now symbolized the summit's rebirth. After finishing his meal, Henry was silent for a few moments. His crew's cameras continued to roll, capturing the tense moment. "Surprising," he finally admitted with visible reluctance. "There's a rare balance between tradition and innovation, a deep understanding of historical value without falling into stagnant nostalgia." Coming from him, it was practically an ovation. The tension in the room began to dissipate. Then, in a calculated move, Henry added, "Of course, there are technical adjustments needed. Certain elements could be more refined, more precise, perhaps with proper guidance." The guidance was more than proper, a firm voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see Paul Hayashi, who had entered discreetly during Henry's meal. His face was a contradictory mix of pale and red with fury. "I came to see the disaster for myself before taking legal action," he announced, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "And I find this, my family's heritage being distorted and exploited for cheap publicity." The festive atmosphere instantly crumbled. Customers exchanged worried glances. Journalists moved closer, sensing conflict. Robert stepped forward, trying to lead Paul to a more private area, but the man was determined to make a scene. "You're all being deceived," Paul exclaimed, raising his voice even more. "This place does not legitimately belong to Robert Vance. There are documents, there is proof." It was then that the unexpected happened. Mrs. Chiu, the 89-year-old Japanese lady, slowly rose from her table. With small but determined steps, she approached Paul. "Young Hayashi," she said in a low but clear voice, "your uncle would be very disappointed in your behavior today." Paul paled even further, clearly recognizing the elderly woman. "Mrs. Chiu, you don't understand the legal situation." "I understand perfectly what honor is, young Hayashi, and your uncle understood it too." She looked around the renovated cafe, a serene smile lighting up her wrinkled face. "He would be proud of what I see today, proud to see his legacy respected and renewed." Other guardians of memory joined her, forming a semicircle around Paul. There was no hostility in their faces, only a quiet determination that carried the weight of decades of lived history. "Your uncle told me, weeks before he became gravely ill, that he feared for the summit's future," Mrs. Chiu continued. "That you saw the cafe only as a piece of property, not as the cultural heart it has always been." Paul opened his mouth to protest, but found no words in the face of the moral authority of these ladies who had intimately known his family for generations. "I have legal rights," he finally managed to say, though his voice had lost its strength. "Are you sure?" The voice of Marcella, Robert's lawyer, sounded from the cafe's entrance. She stepped forward, holding a folder. "Because we just found Mr. Hayashi's original will, registered 6 months before his passing. It's quite explicit about his intention to sell the cafe to someone who would preserve its cultural legacy." The color completely drained from Paul's face. His gaze shifted between the lawyer and the elderly ladies, desperately searching for a way out. It was at that moment that Beatrice stepped forward, offering him a cup of coffee. "Why don't we talk?" she suggested with surprising calm. "About your uncle's true legacy, about what this place means to so many people." Something in the unexpected kindness seemed to break Paul's last resistance. He accepted the cup with trembling hands and allowed himself to be guided to a more secluded table, where Robert and Marcella awaited him for a conversation that promised to be long and necessary. Meanwhile, Henry Martin watched the scene with undeniable fascination. When his gaze met Beatrice's, there was something new there, a reluctant respect, perhaps even regret. The Summit Cafe had survived its first major crisis since the renovation. And somehow it emerged even stronger, rooted not only in its history, but in the community that now gathered to celebrate its rebirth. 3 months after the tumultuous reopening, the Summit Cafe was flourishing like never before. The tables were constantly occupied, with queues forming during peak hours. The combination of renewed tradition and respectful innovation had won over both old patrons and a new generation of Londoners hungry for authentic experiences. It was a sunny Saturday morning, and Beatrice was supervising a Franco-Japanese pastry workshop in the experimental kitchen, now transformed into an educational space open to the community. Around her, 12 participants, from teenagers to seniors, were learning the technique for making a dessert that fused the French eclair with traditional Japanese flavors. "The secret is in the temperature of the choux pastry," she explained, demonstrating with precise movements, "and in the subtlety of the matcha. We don't want it to dominate, just to dance with the other flavors." The confidence with which she led the class contrasted sharply with the discreet waitress Robert had met months earlier. That Beatrice now existed only in memory, replaced by a woman who had reclaimed her professional strength and identity. On the other side of the glass, separating the experimental kitchen from the main room, Robert watched the scene with a mixture of pride and admiration. He was talking to a group of entrepreneurs who had requested a meeting to understand the management model that had made the summit such a talked-about success story. The difference isn't just in the products or the atmosphere, he explained. It's in the philosophy. We've built a structure where every employee has an active voice and a share in the results, where transparency and respect are non-negotiable. One of the entrepreneurs, the owner of a department store chain, seemed skeptical. That works in a boutique cafe, Vance, but in larger operations, with hundreds of employees, that's exactly why I came to see the operation for myself, a familiar voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see Paul Hayashi, impeccably dressed, approaching the table. Robert stood to greet him with a firm handshake. The atmosphere between them, though still marked by mutual caution, had changed significantly since the confrontation on reopening day. The long and difficult conversation that day had resulted in a surprising agreement. Paul had relinquished his claims to a share in the summit in exchange for a strategic partnership. Robert would invest in a new project of Paul's, not real estate, but a cultural center dedicated to preserving the memory of immigrants in London. The project would be housed in a historic mansion that had belonged to the Hayashi family for generations, and the Summit Cafe would provide catering services for its events. The numbers from the last quarter are impressive, Paul commented, accepting the coffee a waiter offered him, especially considering the current economic climate. Results are a consequence, not the objective, Robert replied. We focused on people, both employees and customers. The rest came naturally, Paul nodded thoughtfully. His transformation in recent weeks was almost as remarkable as that of the cafe itself. Freed from the weight of debt and resentment, he seemed to have rediscovered some of the idealism he must have once possessed. The cultural center is almost ready for its inauguration, he announced. I'd like you and Beatrice, to take a look at the gastronomic proposal we've developed. It needs to be consistent with what you've built here. The mention of Beatrice's name still carried a slight discomfort. The relationship between her and Paul remained delicate, marked by formal respect but far from genuine cordiality. Some wounds would take longer to heal. When the workshop ended, Beatrice joined them, carrying a tray of eclairs freshly prepared by the participants. Our students would like to offer their creation for you to taste, she announced with a smile. The pastries were received with enthusiasm. Even Paul, normally reserved in his praise, seemed genuinely impressed. This reminds me of something my uncle used to do, he commented, after tasting an eclair. In the 70s, he would organize culinary competitions among the staff. The winners had their dishes featured on the menu for a month. An excellent tradition to revive, Beatrice replied, surprising everyone with her openness to Paul's suggestion. After the meeting, when the visitors had left, Robert found Beatrice in the small office at the back of the cafe. She was organizing recipes and feedback notes from the workshop participants, completely absorbed in the task. You continue to surprise me, he commented, leaning against the doorframe. For being polite to Paul? She smiled without looking up from her papers. Don't mistake civility for forgiveness. Even so, 3 months ago the two of you could barely be in the same room. Beatrice finally looked up, her face softened by a thoughtful expression. I've learned something important these past few months, Robert. Holding on to resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. She paused. I haven't forgotten what he did, but I won't let it define my present or my future. Robert approached, sitting on the edge of the desk. Speaking of the future, and he began, a hint of hesitation in his normally confident voice. I've been thinking a lot about ours. Something in the seriousness of his tone made Beatrice put her pen down, giving him her full attention. The summit is established. The team works perfectly, even when we're not here. And I get offers almost daily to expand the concept to other neighborhoods, other cities. Are you considering it? She asked cautiously. Not in the way they propose. I don't want a standardized chain with an operations manual and identical products. He paused, organizing his thoughts. What interests me is the philosophy, the model of humane management we've developed here. Beatrice studied him intently, sensing there was something more behind the conversation. Robert Vance, the ruthless investor, now interested in humanized business philosophy. She teased gently. Who would have thought? He smiled, acknowledging the transformation. Ironic, isn't it? I bought the summit as a business experiment, and ended up rediscovering the purpose of my own work. His eyes met hers with intensity, and finding much more than I expected. The moment between them was charged with unspoken meanings. In recent months, they had carefully navigated the territory of their personal relationship, balancing their professional partnership with growing feelings that both acknowledged but treated with deliberate caution. "What exactly are you proposing?" Beatrice finally asked. "A partnership. A formal, comprehensive one." He took a deep breath. "I want to create an investment fund dedicated to transforming businesses like the Summit, places with history and potential, stifled by toxic or outdated management. And I want you to be my equal partner in this project." The proposal caught Beatrice completely off guard. For a moment she was speechless. "You're serious?" It wasn't a question but an astonished statement. "I've never been more serious in my life." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. "You have something that isn't taught in MBAs or strategy consultancies, a genuine understanding of the human element, of the real impact that business decisions have on actual lives. But I have no experience with investments, with financial analysis." "Exactly. And I had no experience with organizational empathy." He smiled. "We complement each other, Beatrice. Together we can do something truly significant." She stood up, walking to the small window that overlooked the cafe's side alley. She needed space to process what she had just heard, not just the professional proposal, but everything it implied. "Do you understand what you're asking?" she finally asked, her back still to him. "It wouldn't just be a business. It would be a life together," he completed, now by her side. "In every sense, if that's what you want too." Beatrice turned to face him. Her ever-expressive eyes revealed the internal battle between hope and fear, trust and caution. "I'm scared, Robert. Scared to believe completely, to give everything, and find out it was just another fleeting moment in the life of someone with your power." The vulnerability in her voice touched Robert deeply. Gently, he took her hands in his. "I understand your fear, and I can't promise I'll never make mistakes." His eyes never left hers for a second. "But I can promise they will never be the same mistakes that hurt you before, that I will always listen, that I will admit when I'm wrong, and most importantly, that I will never, ever use our relationship as a bargaining chip or an instrument of power." The silence that followed was filled by the distant hum of the cafe in full swing, lively conversations, the clinking of cups, occasional laughter. It was the sound of what they had built together, from emotional and structural rubble. Slowly, Beatrice intertwined her fingers with his. "Yes," she said simply. The answer contained everything: acceptance of the professional proposal, the personal relationship, the shared future. It was a small word carrying a monumental decision. Weeks later, on the awards night for the London Food Guide, the Summit Cafe received the awards for Newcomer of the Year and Best Historical Cultural Revival. Beatrice, wearing an elegant navy blue dress, went on stage to accept the award, accompanied not only by Robert, but by a small entourage that included Mrs. Clara Gable and two of the Guardians of Memory. "This award doesn't just celebrate a commercial establishment," she said in her speech, her voice firm and emotional. "It celebrates the possibility of reconstruction, of rebirth, of transformation through genuine listening and mutual respect." Her eyes met Robert's in the audience as she continued. "The summit taught me that our most painful stories don't have to define our destiny, that we can turn scrap metal into art, hurt into wisdom, silence into an active voice. This cafe, which almost disappeared under the weight of oppression, today breathes culture, community, and hope." The audience applauded enthusiastically as she concluded, "We dedicate this recognition to everyone who has ever been silenced in their workplace. May every cup served at the summit be a reminder. There is always a chance for a new beginning. There is always room for growth. And it is always worth fighting for places where humanity is not the exception, but the fundamental rule." The morning after the event, the Summit Cafe opened its doors as usual at 7 a.m. The awards were discreetly placed in a small display case near the counter. Important, but not central. The true center remained what it had always been: people serving people with dignity and purpose. Employees who felt valued serving customers who felt welcomed. A virtuous cycle built on values that, though simple in theory, had become rarities in the corporate world. Beatrice and Robert, sharing a table in the quietest corner of the room, watched the activity with the silent satisfaction of those who know they have created something meaningful. "You know what's most extraordinary?" he commented, taking a sip of his coffee. "That all of this started with a simple business curiosity, and ended up transforming the curious one more than the object of curiosity," she completed, smiling. Between them, on the table, rested the small metal flower, now part of a brooch Beatrice wore occasionally, a symbol of what they had built together: beauty forged from unlikely materials, resilience transformed into art. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual frantic rhythm. But inside the Summit Cafe, a small alternative universe flourished, proving that, even in an age of algorithms and efficiency at all costs, there was still room for ventures where profit and humanity not only coexisted, but mutually strengthened one another. And for Beatrice and Robert, this was just the beginning of a much larger journey, taking that philosophy to other spaces, transforming other toxic environments, and redesigning the meaning of business success in a society hungry for purpose and authentic connection. Meanwhile, every day the aroma of freshly brewed coffee continued to mingle with the scent of fresh bread and sincere conversations, creating that unique and unmistakable fragrance that only arises when people are treated as human beings, not as resources, the scent of true change. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the journey of Beatrice and Robert at the Summit Cafe has touched your hearts. A story that reminds us how dignity at work and mutual respect can transform not just businesses but entire lives. To continue experiencing emotions like this, we have a special playlist with other inspiring narratives. Find it by clicking here on the side. If this story about renewal and humanity in the workplace resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of human relationships. Let us know in the comments about your experiences with workplaces that have undergone positive transformations. Your story could inspire many people.